joining the foundation in January of 2017. Jonathan served as Special Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department of State and lead U.S. negotiator to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. He also has, if you read his bio, a tremendous amount of service to the nation in a number of distinguished government positions, both at the Department of Energy and at the State Department. And in addition to his U.S. government service, he spent 6 years as Director of Climate, Energy, and Pollution Program at the World Resources Institute, where he and I first met 13 years ago when he was helping Illinois develop climate strategies back in the last decade. And those of you who know Jonathan, I know you're glad to see him here this morning and looking forward to his words, because he's not only a thought leader, but just a terrific asset to all of us who work on these very complicated issues that have implications throughout the world. He understands all of those implications. He understands how one policy will have implications in many different places in many different ways, and he's terrific about being able to convey those nuances and those policy implications. So we're thrilled to have him here today. Introduce you to Jonathan Pershing.
So thanks very much, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to see everybody. I'm struck by the increase in size between this year and last year, which is really fabulous. And in some ways, I think coming before you as a representative of the philanthropic community, I can say a similar kind of thing about philanthropy, which I think is finally beginning to move a little bit more actively into this space. I recall last year we were one of only a handful. The group has now grown. We've got people not just from Linden, who you see as one of the co-sponsors, ourselves from Hewlett, the Mitchell Foundation is here, Climate Works Foundation is here, the Energy Foundation is here, Spitzer is here. We're just seeing a substantial improvement in the system. Rich Powell from ClearPath, we've got a bunch of people really showing up, but it still represents a pretty small share of the philanthropic endeavor. And I think that speaks a little bit to what I want to talk to about this morning. I was going to divide my comments really into two parts. The first part is to give you a little bit of a sense about why I think there's been this kind of movement, and I would argue globally as opposed to only nationally. And then the second part to speak a little bit about what I think has to be done, and from our perspective where we at Hewlett are approaching that particular problem. So let me start off with things that I think many of us know, but maybe to put them into a more precise framework. The IPCC report, which laid out 1.5, I think is contentious only in the question of whether or not you believe you have to get to 1.5 or you could manage the dynamics for 2. But we should recognize the global community agreed in Paris to get well below 2 and to strive for 1.5. So it becomes at least a metric for the kind of change we would seek. And it's not particularly surprising if you start looking at damages. Those damages are already quite severe. If you look at projections coming forward from the insurance industry, if you look at the current numbers globally from the insurance industry, something like 85% of all natural disasters in the last 10 years were climate related, and those are now looking at hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of damages and costs. So if you start thinking about managing this problem, it really becomes quite an explicit exercise of where you have to go. If we think about where they're coming from, of course, emissions are coming from every single country in the world, but there are a handful that matter more than others. And the reason I lay this out for this group is that this context matters significantly. It's going to be insufficient if we all succeed in a model in which carbon capture and storage works in the United States and we can't move it to China and to India and to Europe. And so part of the question that we have to grapple with is what makes that global exercise work well. Chinese emissions are now twice the size of those in the United States and growing. And while they are succeeding in meeting the commitments they made because they set themselves an intensity, and I would argue a pretty aggressive intensity target, nonetheless, emissions are not coming down. India, the same thing. They've actually met or on track to meet the targets they've got for renewables, the target they've got for slowing down the growth in fossil fuel emissions, but at the same time, underlying emissions are growing. So I think that the argument that's been made by many in the United States that we don't have to act because others are not acting is wrong. It is, in fact, untrue that others are not acting. They are, and they're acting to meet the agenda and the objectives that they set, and we should be clear, those are relatively stringent targets. So I think we mislead ourselves by saying we can do nothing, we'll be a free rider, we'll wait until others move. We don't have that latitude or that flexibility. It's clear also that as we look at the next steps, not that many are moving on carbon capture and storage. That seems to be a policy that has not yet taken hold and root in all significant ways around the world. So if I look at the people sit at this table, I do not get to participate in similar meetings in Europe or in India or in China. And I think it behooves us to think a little bit about how the work that we do will be expanded. And I would submit there's going to be an opportunity economically as well as politically to move on this agenda with the solutions that we here are beginning to develop and beginning to come forward with. And we should be clear about the state of change that's required in order to meet the targets that the science is giving to us. We've essentially got to see more than a 50% reduction over the next 30 years, and many would argue in the United States getting close to carbon neutral in that same time frame. There is no model in which you can do it without carbon capture and storage. And the IPCC, in its 1.5 report, sets that out explicitly and clearly. So if we start off from the premise that climate is real, and we start from the premise that in order to solve it, you have to have carbon capture, for me the question then is, what's the solution? What are we working on? I want to spend just a few minutes laying out what we at Hewlett think the solution might include. So the first thing is that we've been working on this now for a couple of years. This is not a brand new exercise for us. I've had the pleasure of working with people like Doug when he was doing the work in Illinois, with people like Julio, with whom we'd worked extensively on thinking about how to build capacity for well over a decade. In my experience at the Department of Energy, this was indeed a significant topic of discussion, but it really hasn't advanced us very far. And if I think of the barriers in some ways, which ones do we certainly see right now? Well, the first one, the technology is still immature, and there's not enough government R&D support. The second one, where the technologies are ready to pilot, there's an insufficient policy framework. We just don't have demand for any kind of offtake. Third, we have some cases where policies and technologies and approaches are ready to scale, but we don't have policy tools that internalize the cost. Very hard to operate in that environment. Markets are inadequate. In both policy and advocacy circles, there's no agreement on a common narrative, on a role for CDR. And while we in this room may have some broad understanding, I would warrant if we asked any group at your table to sit down, even within your table, you might have a slightly different view about where it wanted to go, and we're the advocates. In many CDR development pathways involve technologies that will become mature through CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. And I would submit that this moral hazard question has driven enormous opposition in the public community. And we're going to have to manage that kind of opposition as a clear barrier that we have to overcome. So what we're thinking about is a series of alternatives of where we might go. We think we can use the models for other technology, and Dan raised this last night, and Brad's noted this before. We think we can use other models as a metric against which we can hold ourselves. Wind and solar, for example, started off as very expensive technologies without adequate support. They reached critical scale in no small measure because of policy. Government-funded R&D, followed by subsidies in the US and in Europe, followed by low-cost manufacturing and arguably a protected market in China, followed by moving from prototypes to commercial activity and scaling, and then to set-asides and mandates that fundamentally altered the rate of penetration. That's a pretty interesting framework, a pretty interesting sequence. We have the potential to follow up on that discussion. So our theory of change essentially calls for, first, advancing technology to capture carbon. It's best done probably with government support, corporate, as well as state-owned enterprise R&D programs. This is not one option for one sector to play in. This is an exercise that requires a comprehensive suite of actors across the entire spectrum. We anticipate it will involve venture capital investments and startups looking to commercialize new technologies, as well as major corporations that move parts of their R&D budget into the system. We then have to create markets and buyers that value CO2 from carbon dioxide removal. We think it'll be done through a combination of mandates, set-asides, offsets, or some people call them insets in the case of carbon, and building credits into existing clean energy, low-carbon fuels, and carbon pricing standards. If you can do that, you overcome that next set of hurdles and barriers. And finally, we need to build out the infrastructure necessary to support carbon dioxide removal. That includes pipelines, We've heard discussion on that at some length. And if we think pipelines were tough, they're going to be tougher going forward. How we manage that is clearly a critical exercise. That means we have to figure out facilities to use CO2 in products, in everything from plastics to cement to soils, as well as the regulatory and financial mechanisms to facilitate this kind of growth. So if we succeed, what could we imagine? What could and should we strive for as a set of goals working on this? We think in the next maybe 3 to 5 years, we'd have a series of deliverables, very concrete and specific things we could imagine succeeding with. The first, we should have a series of CDR research centers in the US, the EU, and China. They should be grown, they should have capacity. These are not just 1 or 2 people working in a lab. These are dozens of people with network infrastructures at scale. The second, direct air capture technology for removing, using, or sequestering carbon would be accomplished, and we should look at prices of less than $100 a ton. That should be the ambition we should set for ourselves. We should push for that within the next 3 to 5 years. We think we should have a metric in terms of how many facilities should be up and operating. We're using 60 as the number that we're suggesting. 60 facilities in operation or planned, collectively sequestering 1 billion tons of CO2 per year. That's a down payment on the scales that we need, but it would put us in a position to really move the agenda forward. And we think we have to think about mainstreaming CDR as well as climate policy into all major policy initiatives. That doesn't just mean that we have a climate initiative from the climate community inside of Congress and the Select Committee. It means when you talk about the Ag Bill, there's a climate piece. And when you talk about tax policy, there's a climate piece. And when you talk about revising DOE's standards and EPAC, there's a climate piece. And those are central and play out in terms of next steps. And that has to be in every single proposal that we see going forward, and it has to be scaled. We should make no bones about it. The size and the extent of our effort here is not sufficient to say, I can have a small piece in someone's marginal legislation as a rider. This has got to be in everything we do and in everything we look at. Now, these might sound like difficult tasks, but I would submit that the alternative is much more devastating. We're currently looking at a trajectory that is rather untenable. We're looking at trillions of dollars of damage in cost. These are not necessarily ones we want to incur. And if we use the International Energy Agency, where I had the privilege of working for a number of years in the 1990s, we used their most recent modeling data. The scale is not all that big. We need a 3 to 4% increase in terms of investment to make this world the world we want. A world in which green and clean and low carbon is the option, but a world in which energy supply is untethered, in which we have reliability in our systems, in which we have access for communities around the world. If we want to do that, that has to happen today. That can't wait for 10 years while we dither. It has to happen immediately. It has to happen at scale, and it has to engage all of us. So it's a pleasure for us to be here as part of the process, a pleasure to work with you as colleagues as we set this in motion and continue the motion that's already underway, and we look forward to the next couple of days and to working together. So thanks very much.